Hey everybody, welcome back to Building Steam. I'm Brian Fadrosh of Brian Fadrosh Designs. Welcome back down to the shop. I hope everybody had a safe and happy Thanksgiving. The holiday gave me the opportunity to have some spare time to myself simply because I wasn't at my day job. So I got to do two things that I really enjoy the most. One, spend some time with my two favorite humans in the world eating a lot of really good food. And in addition to that, getting into the shop and working a little bit. So this holiday weekend, I decided to work a little bit more on my grifter cosplay. And I started off by doing a scrap build of the utility belt. Now, since Grifter came from the 80s, he's got a ton of different pouches and, doodads and details. And then in doing the utility belt, I decided he needed a bandolier. So then I started working on the bandolier. So then working on the bandolier, I decided that not only that, but I also needed two big knives. And then along with two knives, well, if I'm going to do two new knives, I need to do a new gun. So, I started working on a new hand cannon. And then, of course, I need to put that somewhere. So I needed to do a thigh holster. So it occurred to me that these types of builds are the ones that I really do enjoy the most. And that's simply because it gives me the opportunity to be able to pick and choose different parts of Grifter that I like through his different versions that you see in the comics. Now, with that being the case, I do want to say that my Grifter cosplay is going to have feet. And if you get that reference, leave me a comment down below. But it also occurred to me, secondly, and most importantly, that because I have so many different pieces, I'm going to be spending a lot of time detailing. And doing the detail in a build is the part of the process that I enjoy the most because I find that it gives me the opportunity to be the most creative and the most artistic with the choices that I make. As that's the case, I wanted to talk about the three types of detailing techniques that I use the most and that I enjoy the most, and I think get you the biggest bang for your buck for those. So we're going to talk about detail lines, we're going to talk about adding leather texture to foam, and one of my favorites is going to be hot glue rivets. And the reason for the hot glue rivets is just sometimes you just can't get anything small enough into that little spot. So let's start talking about detail lines. Detail lines are going to be that one technique that most people are going to be familiar with. Essentially, all you're doing is tracing out along a line that you want to have be more pronounced in that piece. So as the example here, if we're just going to make the inside of this piece stand out, we trace it out with a pencil. And then what we're going to do is take an incredibly sharp blade and just barely score along that line on the foam. Now, as you're scoring your detail line, there are two things you want to keep in mind. First, you want to make sure you're not pushing the blade too far into the foam. Once you apply heat, that score line is going to open up. So if you're pushing too far into the foam, even just halfway, it's going to open up almost to the very back of the foam and then could obviously influence the integrity of the piece. Secondly, as you're tracing it out, you want to ensure that you're going along the line very slowly and evenly. Doing so just is going to make that line that much more crisp once you apply the heat. So once you've scored it out, you put a block of wood down because you never want to use your heat gun directly onto your cutting mat, as I have found myself on numerous occasions. And then as you can see, by applying heat right along that score line, it will make that line stand out even more. And that's simply because it's embossed into the foam. Another example of when this technique works out really well is when you want to make something look like plated metal with rivets, which we'll get to a little bit later in the video, but you don't want to cut out individual pieces and then glue them all together. You're simply drawing in those detail lines for where the plates are going to meet, heating them up with the heat gun to open them up so when you finish everything, it's going to have that nice deep groove. But then you'll be able to add rivets in to make it look like individual pieces. One of the techniques for details that I really like is making foam look like leather. And I do that through what a lot of people refer to as the tinfoil trick. I just do it a little bit differently than most. So we're going to talk about making a leather-like belt. Now, the one thing I do want to mention is this technique works best for thinner foams. So we're talking like 1 or 2 millimeter, 5 or 6 millimeter at most. Now, granted, this process works on 10 millimeter foam. However, it's not going to look like leather because it's so thick. And if leather is actually 10 millimeters thick, I would be terrified of seeing what animal that came off of. So let's say we're making a leather belt. First and foremost, I'm going to trace out my piece, or that belt piece, on a piece of foam that is going to be a little bit bigger than what I actually need. And the reason for that being is once we apply the heat to get the texture into it, it has a tendency of curling the edges. So if you're doing it as a broader piece first, you won't have that curl as much, and it gives you a much nicer line. So what we're going to do is we're going to mark out our belt, but again, don't cut it out yet. And while I'm doing that, I'm going to turn my iron on. Now, yes, I am using my own iron. I am not using the iron that my wife has up in her sewing studio because she would kill me for doing so. But while I'm waiting for my iron to heat up, I'm going to take a piece of tinfoil that is going to be big enough to cover a good portion of what I have marked out, and I'm going to pre-crinkle it. And yes, pre-crinkling is the technical term for what you are doing. Once I have that crinkled out and my iron is nice and hot, I'm going to put my piece of foil down onto the foam, and then I'm going to apply the iron to the foil. Now, as I'm doing this, I want to make sure that I am pushing straight down. I do not want to move the iron back and forth. What that will do is smooth out the foil, and then you won't get as much texture in there. And then you're going to just repeat the process until you get the whole entire section covered. Once that is done, you can cut the piece out in its entirety, and you will have that texture over the whole entire piece without having any curled edges. Now, obviously, there are going to be some instances, such as with my pouches, where I have the outside edge that I cut out that doesn't have the leather texture to it. So how do I fix that? I have a second tip for you. What you'll do is once you're ready to apply that texture to those edges, you will take a piece of tinfoil, ball that up so you do have that texture, and then you're going to hold it with a pair of pliers or tweezers or something that is not going to have your hand get hot. And then you're going to apply the heat gun directly to that ball of tinfoil. And then what you're able to do is take that and apply that pressure onto the edges, and that will still give you that texture and look fairly consistent from one edge to the next, simply because it's the same process, just on a much smaller scale. Rivets are a nice little detail that you can add to any cosplay, especially if it's supposed to look like metal, that really enhances that metal look and really helps sells it. Now, a number of people have done rivets in a number of different ways. Everything from googly eyes to cutting down round dowels into smaller sections to using real rivets to furniture tacks, thumb tacks. But sometimes you need a rivet in a really, really small little spot. And what I have found works really well is hot glue. So once my hot glue gun has come up to temp, what I'll do is decide where I want to put that rivet, and then I'm going to dot that glue right onto that area using a small circular motion until I get that nice little dome. And then what I'll do to make that glue set a little bit faster and to keep that dome-like appearance is flip a can of compressed air upside down and then just squirt a little bit of that super cold liquid onto that rivet, getting it to set and retaining that dome look. Now again, when you're doing this, you want to make sure you're keeping the piece as flat and as level as possible, because your hot glue will have a tendency of being able to wander off, and then you end up getting an oblong looking rivet as opposed to a nice round rivet. It does take a little bit of practice. However, hot glue is a great way to be able to add those little itty bitty details to your build to really help sell that metal look. As an example, I used very small round hot glue rivets to my Warhammer 40K along the seam line to make it look like two pieces of metal welded together. The problem that I did with that is I had already built the piece together as one piece, so it was rounded. So getting that to stay level as I was doing each individual rivet took some patience and some time, but needless to say, came out, I thought, really, really well. So those are my top 3 detailing techniques that I use the most often in my builds. And the reason I use them the most often is simply because they're multi-purpose techniques. You can use the same exact technique and get a completely different effect from it. Some great examples would be, for score lining, if you score line on the underside of the foam and then form it out, it's a great way to be able to add fake muscles to EVA foam. Probably something I could use a little bit more of myself. I used the leather technique on my Blue Devil helmet to give the skin a much more organic look. And I've used hot glue to simulate weld lines on my Steampunk Rocketeer helmet. So again, with the fact that you can use them in so many different ways, I'm sure there are going to be ways that you've used them that I haven't even thought about. And if that's the case, leave me a comment down below. Would absolutely love to see them and try them out myself. If you're enjoying the content that we're putting together here on the channel, by all means, make sure you're hitting the like button. Please hit the subscribe button to find out when our next videos are coming out. And as always, ladies and gentlemen, be inspired, make, create, and most of all, be kind to yourselves. We'll see you in the next video.